Somewhere around the year 170 AD, the most powerful man in the known world sat down in a tent at the edge of a military campaign and wrote something that was never intended to be read. He was not writing a treatise, and he was not writing for posterity. He was writing the way people write when they are genuinely struggling, privately, urgently, with the kind of honesty that only comes when there is no audience to perform for. What he wrote across many such evenings over many such years was a series of notes to himself on the single question that seemed to matter most to him in the midst of an extraordinary life filled with extraordinary demands. How does a person remain themselves, remain clear, remain grounded, remain genuinely free when everything around them is in motion and when so much of what happens is entirely beyond their control? The man was Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, one of the most capable rulers the ancient world produced, and what he wrote has survived nearly 2,000 years under the title Meditations. Tonight we explore the central idea that runs through every page of that remarkable document, an idea so simple that it can be stated in a single sentence, and yet so demanding in practice that Marcus Aurelius had to remind himself of it again and again across an entire lifetime. The idea is this: there is one thing you can always control, and it is enough. The Stoic philosophers who shaped Marcus Aurelius's thinking had a concept they called the dichotomy of control, the fundamental distinction between the things in our lives that are within our power and the things that are not. In our power, our judgments, our choices, our responses, the quality of attention we bring to any given moment, the values we decide to act from, the meaning we choose to make of whatever arrives. Not in our power the weather, the economy, other people's opinions, the outcomes of our efforts, the behavior of those around us, the 1,000 variables of circumstance and chance that shape the surface conditions of our daily lives. Marcus Aurelius returned to this distinction constantly, not because it was a comfortable idea, but because he found, through hard experience, that it was the only one that actually held up under the pressure of everything his life demanded of him. The practical insight he developed from this distinction was something that looks almost embarrassingly simple on the surface, but reveals its depth only when you try to actually live it. He wrote in different forms throughout the Meditations that the quality of your life is not determined by what happens to you, but by how you choose to respond to it, and that this choice, however constrained by circumstance it might feel, is never entirely taken from you. Even in the most difficult circumstances, even when the external world has left you very little room to move, there remains a space, a small but inviolable interior space, between what happens and what you do with it, between the event and the response, between the world's demand and your answer to that demand. Marcus Aurelius called the cultivation of that interior space the one work that is always available. And he spent his life, a life that included war and plague and political betrayal and personal loss, trying to keep that space wide enough that he could always choose his response rather than simply being swept along by circumstance. Now, it would be easy to misread this idea as a counsel of passivity, as though Marcus Aurelius is suggesting that we should simply accept whatever happens and content ourselves with managing our inner response, while the external world does what it will. But that is not what he was saying, and his own life, which was one of extraordinary outward engagement and enormous practical effort, makes this clear. He was not suggesting that we stop trying to change the things around us, or stop working toward the outcomes we care about. He was suggesting something more precise, that we should do everything in our power to influence the external world while holding our sense of well-being, our sense of self, and our fundamental equanimity completely independent of whether those efforts succeed. Act fully, prepare carefully, try your absolute best, and then release the outcome, because the outcome was never entirely yours to control. What is yours? What is always, under all circumstances, entirely yours, is the quality of the effort and the integrity of the response to whatever the effort produces. There is a phrase that appears in the Meditations that Marcus Aurelius seems to have used as a kind of inner compass, a question he returned to whenever he felt himself being pulled toward anxiety, resentment, or despair by the circumstances of his day. The question, rendered in its simplest form, is this: is this within my control, or is it not? If the answer is yes, if there is something genuinely within his power, then the appropriate response is clear and immediate. Do what can be done, with full attention and full effort, without unnecessary drama or complaint. If the answer is no, if the thing troubling him lies outside the domain of his own choices and actions, then the appropriate response is equally clear. Release the attachment to outcome, redirect the attention toward what can be influenced, and stop spending the limited energy of a human life in resistance to things that were never going to yield to that resistance. This sounds straightforward, and in theory it is. But Marcus Aurelius was honest enough to record the ways it kept failing in practice, the ways that worry about uncontrollable things crept back in, the ways that resentment about outcomes he could not have changed continued to disturb his peace in ways he knew were counterproductive, the ways that the distance between knowing this principle and actually living it was wider than he would have liked. Which is why the Meditations read less like a philosophical treatise and more like a daily practice, because that is precisely what they were. Let us bring this into the territory of your own life, because what Marcus Aurelius was wrestling with in that tent near the Danube 2,000 years ago is not fundamentally different from what you navigate in your own ordinary days. Think about the things that cost you the most energy right now, the situations that keep pulling your attention back, the worries that return in the quiet moments, the frustrations that sit like stones in the middle of your days. If you sorted them honestly against Marcus Aurelius's question, is this within my control or not? How many of them would fall into the second category? How much of the energy you spend is spent on the weather, on things that are happening around you and to you, over which you have, in the end, very little actual power? And if that energy were redirected, if even a portion of what you spend in worry and resistance were turned instead toward the things you can genuinely influence, how different might your days feel? This is the practical gift that Marcus Aurelius spent his life trying to give himself, and that his Meditations offer to anyone willing to take them seriously. Not the freedom from difficulty, not the removal of hardship, Not the promise that life will become simpler or more cooperative, but the radical and deeply liberating recognition that your inner life, however constrained by circumstance, is always yours to govern. And that this governance, this quiet, consistent, practiced sovereignty over your own judgments, responses, and choices is not a consolation prize for the absence of external control. It is, Marcus Aurelius believed, the only kind of freedom that was ever genuinely available to anyone. The practice I want to offer you tonight is simple enough to try in the next 24 hours, and demanding enough to keep you occupied for a lifetime. The next time something disturbs your peace, whether it is a piece of news, a person's behavior, an outcome you were hoping for that didn't arrive, or simply the ambient low-level anxiety that seems to accompany modern life as a constant companion. Pause and ask Marcus Aurelius's question. Is this within my control, or is it not? If there is something you can do, do it fully and without hesitation. If there is nothing you can do, then practice gently but firmly the act of releasing the attachment to a different outcome. Not because you do not care, but because you have decided to spend the finite and irreplaceable energy of your attention on the things that can actually yield to it, rather than on the things that never could. If this episode brought you something of value, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe with notifications on, so every new reflection finds its way to you when the evening is quiet and the time feels right. Thank you for being here.